Okay, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. This is the first in a series of charrettes on using observation networks to advance Earth system understanding, state-of-the-art data model integration, and frontiers. And this is going to be the first in a series or group of interactive webinars to be held roughly monthly from now through February 2018. And these efforts are going to culminate in a cross-network international workshop that will be held on this broad topic of using network data to increase Earth system understanding. That's going to be held in Boulder, Colorado at the NEON HQ. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to the charrette leaders. First of all, I don't think I introduced myself. My name is Samantha Weintraub, and I'm a terrestrial biogeochemist at the National Ecological Observatory Network in Boulder, Colorado in the United States. Leading our first charrette today, we have Chris Van Leeuwen and Roland Batts, both at FC Jülich, and also serving in the capacity of representing ISMIC, the International Soil Modeling Consortium, and the European LPER. So Chris and Roland, take it away.
Okay, thank you, Sam, and welcome to everybody. So today we'd like to discuss some present observation networks, or the networks of observatories, and their ambitions and the links to the modeling. As Sam told you, we're going to talk about the survey we did. So first, to say a few words on these observatory networks. So there's the long-term ecological research sites, there's the critical zone observatories, there's the National Ecological Observatory Network, and all these networks are gathering data with the aim of raising the understanding of processes in ecosystems, in the critical zone, in landscapes, so different orientations for the different networks. Still, they are also focusing on the impacts of changes in the landscape, changes in land use, and climate changing. So with this approach, actually they try to measure a broad range of elements in the system, a broad range to observation, but also to have temporal data sets that can cover some of these questions. But even with long-term data sets, elements like climate change, elements like the projections they want to make and the ambition to make, there's still a need for modeling in these, and that's one of the things that was always clearly defined in constructing these networks, that there should be a link to modeling, that there should be abilities of modeling these projections for purposes of ecosystem reanalysis and for the predictions to make. And also these models, they need data, so we need to look at how these data connections to modeling are made. And to come back to these three networks, actually, they have different conceptual models. So when we start with LTER, that's a scope which is near the surface. That's a scope to ecosystem functioning underground, but just near the surface, in contrast to the CZOs, critical zone observatories, that look really vertical to the deeper soil, to the relation of soil formation processes. And then we come to the NEON network, which is a network that tries to look to the more 3- or 4-dimensional view of the landscape. So that's quite different perspectives for the different observation networks. And that was an intriguing start of asking, is there complementarity in data, and is there different links to modeling that we can observe. So these observatories, they are also focusing on understanding of processes, but coupled processes. That means that they try to link processes and understanding through disciplines, and therefore there's also in this modeling approach the new tendency to develop integrated models. And here's two examples of that. So on the left side, there's the reactive transport model of flux TIM, which looks at the hydrologic fluxes, but also the energetic and reactive transport fluxes through the landscape. And on the right hand, you have the DARA model, quite new model, which in the same way looks to hydrological processes in different dimensions, and the energetic and the nutrient fluxes in landscapes. So this kind of integrated models obviously need integrated sets of data, and that was then one of the questions of our survey. So what we would like to investigate was what kind of models, what are the models that use these data of these observatory networks. So the question was also, is there presently gaps in availability of data for these models? Do they have the data they need, or is there some questions to additional data that should be measured in these observatories? And then the question was also for the models. What kind of models are there? Is it really integrated models using these quite elaborated sets of data? So in the survey, we looked to can I go back? Yeah, sorry. In the survey, we looked to finally to look for strategies that are presently elaborated by these modelers and by the people, the PIs of the observatories, for looking at integration of data over the sites, looking at integration of disciplinary information. And finally, we launched the survey through the international LTER and the international CZO communities. So that means that we did a global survey. So it was not only in the United States, it was also in Europe, in Australia. So we got information from CZOs and LTER sites globally. And what kind of a data use did we look for? So we looked to the variables in the models used for different disciplines and different compartments that are measured in these observatories. That means from the atmosphere, from the radar zone, from saprolite bedrock information, from the surface water and the biosphere. So a full set of 52 variables, which are more or less the common measurement variables for the CZOs and the LTERs. Furthermore, we asked for the model applications, whether they use the data from the field measurements or whether they use the data from remote sensing or other kind of a database source, things like that. So we wanted to know which field measure data was actually used and how many variables in the model came from these observatories. And so here's the scope. So you have the global community of critical zone observatories and LTER sites. We addressed we sent out the survey to some 2,000 people approximately, and we've got a full response of some 115 people, so 115 model applications of data of the observatories. And the biggest share was for the LTER site applications, model applications, but only slightly less for CZOs, and we had a nice share of model applications that used data from both LTER and CZO sites in the same model application. So, coming to this geographic distribution, so as I said, we had applications from the different continents, but the largest contribution came from Europe, and with a big share of LTER sites that are modeled, so information that is modeled for Europe. For the USA, there was more modeling reports for the CZOs. And when there is global, that means that it is global models using the data. For the temporal scales, also quite a nice share, but we come back to that later. So also the compartments modeled, there we see the biggest share for always looking at the hydrological information. That's quite logical, but also we see that there was quite a good share of the biosphere and the pedosphere. So there's quite a good distribution over compartments as well as over disciplines. So we did cover quite some disciplines and quite some integrated models also. When we plotted that in the kind of a heat map, so that presents the spatial and temporal scales of these models, of these model applications of the observatory data, then we see that they cover mostly spatially the site to catchment scale, and in time steps actually cover mostly the daily to annual time steps, so that covers most of the models that are applied to these observatory sites. When we look to the different communities, so when you have the LTER model applications, well, LTERs, they are mostly oriented to prediction of climate change, to ecosystem change, and there we see that for the temporal scale, that is more concentrated on the annual, so predictive scale, whereas for CZOs we see that the coverage is more spread, so there's more modeling for shorter time steps or the longer terms. That means that there's really these system understanding models that are more focused on the CZO side. So that's for the understanding of the different orientations of the models. And then we looked into these models to the level of integration. So the level of integration was just an estimation of the model by summing up the disciplines and the compartments that it looked at. So if the model had many compartments covered and many disciplines, then it was a high level of integration. And we noticed in the modeling that it corresponded quite well with the use of variables, which is what we would expect, but it's also still an interesting point for our questioning, because it shows that model integration, integrated models, they can benefit from these observatory networks, because these observatory networks offer indeed the wide spectrum of variables to be used in such integrated models. So this confirms actually that the opportunities offered by these data sets of the observatories. And especially when we look at the asterisks so the models that use data from both the LTR and the CZOs, then we see that these are the most integrated. So these models cover the most variables in the integrated models. And when we enter that data, so the variable use of these models into an ordination, then, well, in the ordination, the models that used the most variables in a common way are centered in such ordination. So in the center, we find again these integrated models using the same set of variables, so common variables from the different disciplines. Whereas when we look to the outliers, when we look to the red dots, which are the CZO models, then we see that specific models to rock weathering, to soil formation, which are typically models for CZOs, they are outlier in this ordination because they use less common measured variables. Same goes for the biotic, and so the typical LTER models that go to the right-hand side. So the biotic modeling also uses more specific variables and less to the common and less to the integrated modeling side, which on the other hand, the hydrological models and the hydrogeophysical models are typically the more integrated, the models that use the most variables in this way. So this organization also well, distinguishes the models that look to physics and to biota, that look to rock and water, but also that look to the above ground and below ground. And when we see that biota are only in the above ground part, we notice, and we also saw in the variables that were reported, that there is little models which cover soil biota. So that was also one of the observations we could make from this survey, that soil biota in these models are still a missing part. And that brings us to the conclusions from this short survey, or short, it took the whole spring period, but still it's a first exercise that we do think we have some interesting conclusions from this survey. That means that for these observation networks, for these observatories, there is quite some opportunity in the data gathered are complementary and offer information and offer good opportunities for these integrated models for the Earth system modeling tendencies that are nowadays present. Furthermore, some specific points, specific conclusions was for the underground biota, which are still lacking in the modeling, and also in the acquisition of data, actually, for many of the sites. And then a final conclusion can be that these integrated models that are, that we focused at especially, they are data hungry, so that's one of the good points. So we have to look for these observatories that indeed they can cover this wide spectrum of measured elements for the systems. And so from these conclusions of this survey, we came to proposing some strategies to integration of these observation networks. And because the future of these observation networks nowadays is questioned, and there's strategies being built both for CZOs and for LTERs. And what we propose is to look together, and also together with the modelers. And then we have to, choose in different strategies. We can choose from starting from topological network structures to building these site structures, or we can start feature-based, start from what kind of geographical gradients and ecosystems do we want to cover in such a network. So there's different strategies, different options that we can propose from just this survey and from this exercise, and that's something we can discuss here, and we'll discuss further in the charrettes also. And finally, there's a strong need, of course, for dialogue between the observation community and the modeling community. And that's an important thing because, firstly, when we see that we only had 115 responses to our question, that means that there is not so much modeling going on with these fully integrated data sets. So we have these strong data sets, and there should be more modeling. Well, perhaps many people did not respond, but there's still some dialogue needed to improve that exercise. So making networks of observatories, of observations, means also making networks of people and their roots. I mean, we are different communities. There's empiricists versus modelers. There's people who look for ecosystems, who look above ground, and people who are looking more underground. Different communities. We have physicists and ecologists, so different backgrounds that we have to bring together, and that's something we try to discuss in these charrettes. So to the left there is the people who are working on these charrettes, and we hope to have some nice discussions in these charrettes, and I think we can open the floor to that now. I think I've run quite quickly through, well, these results of that survey, but I think it opens to some discussion elements, and these we will bring now for this charrette discussion. But I suggest, well, I don't know, Sam, if you take some discussion points on your behalf.
Sure. Yeah, so thank you, Chris. That was excellent. I think that was a great overview of a really interesting survey effort that did highlight some very thought-provoking results. Chris and Roland have prepared 3 discussion points, and those actually mirror kind of the 3 discussion sections of a paper that they wrote on this topic. And so we have some structure for the discussion that we can use to guide us. But if anyone has anything to say, just their impressions, take-homes, responses to the content of the presentation, does anyone have anything to say? You can, at this point, you can feel free to unmute yourself and just go ahead and jump in. If that gets chaotic, we can use the raise your hand function and I can moderate, but I think we'll just try to open it up and hear from what you all have to say. Okay, so looks like from one person, Kathy says in the chat, I keep coming back to what is the question? Yeah, what is the question? So yeah, it's just a valid point. Yeah.
So this is Kathy, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Oh, fantastic. So I mean, you can always build more and more complex models, but you need to have a reason for the complexity and the questions that you're posing to the models. I can build a model that just uses soil carbon and NPP to model soil carbon change over temperature or whatever, or I can use a full-on reactive transport model and include microbial organisms and soil ecology and ecological interactions. So it depends on what the question that we're trying to answer is. And I'm not really seeing any discussion around what those questions are.
Yeah, thanks, Catherine. That's a point that, well, that's actually the second discussion point. So, so that the second element and challenge is questioning: do we need indeed to go to more complex models, or do we need to develop simple models? Well, but the initial question, and that was the first slide, was these observatory networks and these observatories, they all have their specific questions. I mean, they want to raise understanding of processes, and for each of these sites that are in CVO or that are in LTR, there's a conceptual model built for that site with the questions asked specifically for that site, and that's why they measure, well, that's why different sites measure different elements to start with, but also due to their location, to their climatic conditions, there's different questions asked, and these questions are what I tried to emphasize is that these questions are mostly for coupled processes. So we try to couple biotic, abiotic elements in these well, in these observatories, and that's the question for the models. How can we, these coupled process models, they need to be integrated, and they need data of both biotic elements as abiotic elements, and all of a sudden you're in a complexity of questions, and you can, then is the fundamental question is then, do you go for complex models, or do you try to answer these questions with simple models which you will couple and bundle then later on for these coupled processes? Does that tackle some of your questions?
So are we looking then to develop a customize a model for each site? And then are we looking for some kind of discipline standard so we can use data from across different sites on each site model? I agree with everything you're saying here. I'm just flailing on what the ask is.
Yeah. I think it's a matter of strategy for the specific networks. I mean, CZO has these lists of specific questions for its community. LTR has its specific questions for its sites, and so they also develop specific models for specific sites. But there's also the overall networks, and that means we have an observation network which is continentally structured and which can be used in models which are run continentally, and so it's spanning that whole spectrum that, I mean, means the challenge for the future, I think, and each site will have its own thinking of what questions it can answer, but also it has to be in a network that is more continentally organized, structured to be useful at that scale, and to enable, for instance, these more global scale models, which are nowadays so important but need so much validation, and that these rich data sets, because these data sets, they have that temporal element, they have that that they are integrated in different disciplines, and so that makes them unique, and we should be able to link these observatory communities with the modeling communities at that larger scale. I suppose, I think, and that's why, well, that's part of the options for the future, I thought. So, and that should need a strategy and a dialogue.
Yeah, so I mean, I think we have a lot of people on the call who do create and run models for all different kinds of processes. I don't know if anyone wants to jump in, right? Because I don't think we have a dearth of questions. I am actually more of an empiricist myself, but I mean, right, like certain LTERs, maybe they're dealing with woody encroachment. Others are trying to understand the effects of, you know, invasive species or climate change and shifts in precipitation and how that affects regional surface waters and hydrologic dynamics, right? So, like, I echo what Chris says, that there are different there are lots of questions, and they're all regionally specific, and they're all important and can be aided by the development of models that are calibrated and validated with data, I would think. But I would love to hear from other people on the call. If anyone wants to jump in with their own experiences. I know some of you, but I don't want to call on you. I want you to jump in and say what you think. Or maybe you agree with Kathy that that without really strong central questions, that this exercise of linking data and models is not so valuable. What do you think?
Samantha, perhaps can I ask a simple question in terms of definition of model data linkage here, or model data integration?
Yeah. Sorry, say again?
Yeah, this is Ijian Zhang from ITC University of Twente, Netherlands. So I was asking, could you briefly introduce a definition of the model data integration or model data linkage?
Chris, do you feel like you have a good definition that you would like to give for what you guys think about that?
Yeah, well, a model is parameterized, a model has variables, and for a large part of these variables, a model needs data, and data are the elements that come from out there, and out there can be field measurements, out there can be remote sensing, out there can be databases, and that was what we looked for. So, and that was we tried to hook on. How are these models that look to processes in our environment? What kind of data from these observation networks are they using, and which are they not using? And when we come to well, like small-scale models will use small-scale variables and data, and large-scale models will perhaps only look to remotely sense data or things like that, or can they be, and that's then the other question, can these models be validated, calibrated by specific data from such an observation site? So all these questions are data model linkage questions.
Okay, in that sense. Then, for example, from the survey, I see you have so many responses. One thing I was not clear is, for example, if you check currently the climate center, like ECMWF or NCEP, so are those global climate modelers, they are also participating in the survey? And what's their view, if yes, and what's their view on this data model in integration? Because from what you just mentioned, I would see, of course, we want to use data to calibrate, to validate our model, and to understand the model physics, and to perhaps to find the necessary complexity for the model to simulate. But I mean, the data assimilation currently utilized by the climate center has a similar, let's say, concept behind. So I don't know if you receive any response from them in terms of,
Well, I see your point, and actually that point was the starting point from our side, and our side, that means ISMIC. ISMIC is a community of modelers, and many of these modelers, either they say the data of such a local site is not useful for us, or they say it's not available, we can't touch it, and so that was our, well, that intrigued us, and that's why we sent out that survey also, and we did send it out to people through the ISMIC community, so to all these modelers, but of course they did not respond, because the question was, tell us the information of models that use these observatory network data, and they don't use that data, and that can be linked then to the question, is the data available for everybody? That's one of the questions for this data model integration, and the other question is it useful for such well, global scale or regional scale models, which do look at these processes happening at the local site, and for which these observatory networks should have strong opportunities. I mean, they have integrated data sets on the different processes happening on the physical and biotic elements in specific sites. So they could offer strong opportunities for validation, for calibration of these larger scale models. But we see that there is some lack to that, and that's one of the questions. But well, as a result of our survey, we see that, well, we say that there's, in the first place, a dialogue needed, and that was also one of the questions that we wanted to address here, is how to organize such a dialogue. What communities do we have to address, and how can we address them? I mean, you mentioned the global climate model as well. Will they be interested in such a dialogue, or do they say, well, I do data assimilation and I'm not so much interested in what you and physicists do? So that's one of the questions. So,
and let me jump in for a sec, just because we have various things going in the chat, and if I can read some of these, perhaps for people who are not having their audio working or just prefer to go over the chat. So Kathy says data model integration is a whole domain in itself. What we're talking about sounds more like a social problem of knowing what is out there and available. Deb Johnny says data model integration should be or is defined as matching model prediction and observations by modulating model parameters and or states using some kind of statistical estimation. That's one definition. Joe and Lucille said, we totally agree with Kathy. Integrating models and using larger data sets is better when we have defined questions to answer coming from different fields, which I think I would agree strongly with, but I don't think we lack those questions. And then Kathy also said global Earth system models may not be the same model that would be appropriate for these network observation sites. And I think that's a really interesting question that maybe we could talk more about. Katharina said, maybe we're talking about model application or calibration, or is it model application or maybe model calibration and validation? And then Claudia says, my question is there any chance to see the structure of the available data more closer? So Claudia, I guess I will just respond to the last one by saying we are going to have a whole charrette, probably going to be our third charrette in this series, is going to be on the data. And we're going to have representatives who think really deeply about how to deliver and organize the data and make it available. We're going to have people from ISNIC, we're going to have someone from NEON, we're going to have people from LCER and CZO, and all of the networks have different approaches toward delivering data and making it available, including the metadata, the frequency that they deliver, observations, et cetera. But we are going to do a whole charrette on that topic. So I think the question about the global models too is an interesting one, and I think I see some people on the call that do work with global models. I mean, it seems like part of the reason why it's really difficult to get network data observations into those would be scale, right? That we're really talking about different scales for a pixel in an Earth system model is very different than a plot that you would measure NPP on in a network site. And so does that mean that network observatory site data is not useful in global modeling, or does that mean we have to come up with techniques to use it in global modeling? Or I'd be really interested to hear from some of you that work at those large scales what you think about that.
Yeah, that's, I think, a very good question, that we totally join also the statement that there is maybe a match of, like, there's a conflict between what Earth system models demand and what sites and networks of sites can deliver. So we have these land surface models and coupled land surface models and Earth system models, which work on a grid scale of a degree or of some eighth of a degree, while the networks that we focus on in this workshop are CZO and ELTER, which are usually one site or of a few square kilometers or a catchment scale. So there's a scale mismatch maybe, but as we have a growing computational capacities, the Earth system models increase in resolution, and we become more and more able to apply these site data to land surface models, Earth system models. And actually there are networks that do already work with Earth system modeling communities at the global scale, say FluxNet and ICOS, for example, which have very harmonized and standardized data collection systems available, while we have CZO and LTER and NEON that work that are in their origin driven by site PIs, so very different to FluxNet and ICOS. And it would be nice to make the resources available from CZO and LTER and NEON to Earth system modelers, and that's one objective that we are looking for, so, to merge these interests, which are kind of conflicting, but they are complementary as well, because we have these really complex Earth system models which have a high demand in data, while CZOs and LTER, they partly focus on small-scale processes, on very specific processes, but there's a lot of synergies between both networks and between global modeling communities, and making the impact of these processes which are investigated visible also is very important.
Yeah, we had a couple more things come through in the chat. Should we as modelers be focused on linking models across scales, perhaps, instead of delivering scale invariant models? So that's a really good point. And then another comment we had from Yi Jiang was the current development shows the tendency to have models at various scales, such as GCM, RCM, LAM, et cetera. So, yeah, really good. What about, should we look at questions number 2 and 3 discussion points, since we're approaching 10 minutes left of the webinar, just to see if there was any other specific questions or topics we wanted to throw out? We talked a bit about complex versus simple models. Right, and so this last bullet point, like, you know, merging models or linking models instead of building scale invariant models, but sort of linking in models that work in different processes, in different domains across different scales. Is that, maybe that's a fruitful way forward for the community? I know that's something that ISNIC has been thinking about and talking about, trying to maybe help establish, or already has one even. Chris, is that true?
That's true, but to be really operational, well, we need to build it further. I mean, we're also thinking about the data platform to just give repository to just link people to data at different scales and both temporal and spatial scales, just to show data availability and to enhance this development of indeed developing models that cross these different scales. And because actually we are defining like those Earth system models as the global scale model and the continental scale model as something completely disconnected from the models that look to a site, but actually they are modeling quite many processes which are also working at the site and which are the processes that are studied specifically and well, in these observation networks. So CZO and LTER, they actually are built to understand models, understand processes, which are processes that are also in these big scale land surface and Earth system models. So there should be some connection across these scales, and that should not be one model that covers it all. That of course we agree, but there should be some complexity in the models as well, and we need these multidisciplinary data sets. We need data sets which can be used even if they are only measured at sites, different sites. But then when we think about constructing these sites in such a way that they can be used at these larger scale models and for larger scale purposes, that's one of the ambitions, and that's one of the challenges for the future for these networks. So that was
and just to inject some more comments from the chat. So
yeah.
Claudia made an interesting comment in response to EJAN, which was right, that models are being developed at different scales, but she doesn't necessarily see much effort to then bridge the scales, which is an interesting point. And then in response, you know, on the other hand, if you talk to farmers or city managers, they all want high-res data, so perhaps bridging the scale is actually a downscaling issue. Kathy says, as a modeler, I'd like to see a single API to access network data, as well as conferences which bring experimentalists, observationalists, and modelers together to identify and explore scientific questions of interest. And I would say that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to have one of those in February, so hopefully that will be useful. But I mean, I think everyone, we would agree that that's a huge, that's needed.
Yeah, and next charrette is also linked to AGU. It's just a week before AGU, but there will be occasions at AGU to discuss further on what in the next charrette will be presented. So that's a good point, but we try to tackle that in the next charrette also.
Yeah, and this is an interesting, the last discussion point about, you know, trying to think in terms of integration across, perhaps across disciplines. So I don't know if anyone on the call has experience maybe as a hydrologist really trying to work with ecologists, or as a soil physicist really trying to work with a tree physiologist, or, you know, could anyone speak to some of sort of challenges and opportunities of really trying to do work, either observations or to try to build a model that really links disparate disciplines together, and what are kind of the opportunities and challenges there? Does anyone have any comments on that?
Samantha, maybe I have a question on the integrated observation. So for CZO, LTER, NEON, all the observation sites, they have the similar protocol for observations?
Well, so I can really only speak more to NEON because that's the one that I have the most familiarity with. And at NEON, we do. Everything is very standardized. It's extremely top-down. So everything is measured really the exact same way with this very standardized suite of data products that result. My understanding is that LTER and CZO are not really that way, that I think there are perhaps a set of core variables that are measured at all the sites that people do try to converge on common methods, but it's much more PI driven, it's bottom up, it is regional and site question based. And so you know, in some ways that could be a challenge for modelers, but on the other hand, as some other people were pointing out, if the idea is to develop models that address specific questions that are important to those regions and sites, one could argue that those networks are doing a better job of gathering the data that is important there to inform those questions that could then be enveloped into models. So I think it is different across the networks, and again, I think we'll get a little more into that when we do in our third charrette, when we talk specifically about data availability and data collection. But thank you for bringing that up.
Thanks.
Yeah, so Kathy said, just as a response to my question before, I've worked with adding biogeochemistry into hydrologic models, and there are definitely different base assumptions that have to be ironed out. And then Peter added, a Chapman Conference proposal is being submitted and will be reported upon at the AGU Pre-Conference International CZO Workshop. Paul Schroeder will report, and the subject will be tracing porosity across CZO arch. So it sounds like some people on the call are already thinking about this and trying to make headway, which is exciting. So we're converging on just a couple minutes left. We don't want to take too much of everyone's time. So Chris, can you go to maybe your last slide? Do you have a last slide there? Yeah.
First, this one.
So Chris and Roland put all these results into a discussion paper, which they really recently submitted to Earth System Dynamics. And so all of these comments that you have would actually be great if you're interested to go to the discussion forum for the paper and make these comments, give it a read, put in your input, try to make it better. Let's keep this discussion going forward. And then we are going to hold, is there another slide about the next threat?
Yeah.
So December 6th, which is, I believe, about 4 weeks from today, same time, 9 a.m. Mountain, 5 p.m. Central Europe time. We have Lejo Flores and Pam Sullivan, who are both involved in the US CZO network, are going to give the next charrette on linking conceptual to numerical models of varying spatiotemporal scales of critical zone ecosystem processes. So it'll be similar to this in that they'll have some presentations. I know they're planning on bringing in various people from across the CZOs, different CZO PIs that are doing this kind of work to give mini lightning talks, and then again, maybe half hour for questions and open discussion. So mark your calendars for that. If anyone has one last word they want to get in here. But otherwise, let's thank Chris and Roland. This was a great discussion. Thank you all for taking the time to come and participate and interact on this topic. We hope you'll stay involved through the discussion paper, through future charrettes, and we're excited to continue this discussion. So thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Sam, for hosting.